did something kind of unusual for me the other day and actually ordered some material for a project. While I'm waiting on that, I kind of came up with the idea that it would be really nice for me to have a shop stool rather than constantly sitting on buckets like this. It'd be really nice to have something that I could use when I was TIG welding or soldering or working on brakes, whatever. So it needs to be adjustable height. Maybe one bucket, maybe a little lower. It's probably 2 bananas or so. For TIG welding, I probably want it a little bit higher than this. Call that maybe a cubit and a half. And obviously we want it to roll around, and I've got these casters. I think they came off of a toolbox that I jammed under a workbench, but I'm actually only going to use 3 of them. If you have 3, all 3 are always in contact with the floor, so you don't get the wobble. If you have 4 and the floor's a little uneven, kind of have it rock back and forth, and I don't really want that to happen. Since I just built this CNC plasma cutter, I figure this is a pretty fun project that I can do to kind of learn this and get things tuned on it a little bit better. So now I've just got to spend some time on the computer drawing up a cool looking stool. That looks good. Turns out this old computer does have enough steam power to run sheet cam on it. It should make it easier to program the tool paths and do lead ins and outs. Turns out when I exported the DXF for this, SheetCam didn't like the way I did it, and it turned my circles into not quite circles. And it looks like I forgot to check the box for doing the lead-in where it pierces, so I have a little blowout there. Went back and changed my export settings, and now my circles are much closer to being circles. This is a good opportunity for me to experiment with some different thicknesses of material and try to get the cutting speeds dialed in. These are a little bit too fast and it's not cutting the whole way through. One of the things I really like about this is I can take a random piece of scrap, like this piece of C-channel, and turn it into usable parts. Or turn it into scrap with things that sort of look like parts. So I was kind of trying to jam these parts into this piece of stock. And in doing so, I kind of ran up into this fillet on the inside here. So it didn't cut through. It just blew out a bunch of slag, and I think ended up dragging the part over. But we can grab another piece of plate and hit go again. One of the problems I've noticed that I'm having is I'm getting angled cuts on the sides, and they're both angled the same way. I noticed some angles on some of the other parts as well, but it's much more apparent on the thicker material. I kind of thought that it was because my torch height wasn't quite right, because, well, nothing I'm doing is flat. So if we think about the end of our torch, the plasma beam or flame, I don't know what you call it, comes out sort of a football shape. I guess in metric that would be like a rugby ball. And so if you're cutting too high, it's going to undercut a little bit because it's up here. And if you're cutting too low, you're going to have a little bevel on it the other way. You want to be right in the middle where it's the most straight. But if my height was wrong, you would see a bevel kind of the same on each side, but that's not what I'm getting. I'm getting it kind of going one way and not quite as much going this way, but a little bit. Which leads me to think one of two things is happening. Either this torch isn't totally square to the workpiece, or very likely when I screwed this up in previous screw-ups, I just trashed the nozzle on it, so I'm not getting a consistent football shape coming out of that. I need to pick up some fresh nozzles and do some more tuning on this. But for now I can get these parts to work, it just will take a little bit more fettling and fitting. This is obviously more work than I hoped it would be, but it's not taking too long. Since I cut the plates for the casters out of different stock than I had originally planned, I need to mill them down to thickness, and while I'm at that, I'll clean up the other edges. Trying to cut these holes to their final size was a mistake, especially with the machine not being tuned very well. I should have made them undersized and then drilled them out, but I cleaned them up with a drill anyway, but that still left some hard material to try to tap, which caused problems. I want to TIG weld this together, mostly because I'm trying to learn to TIG weld and I want some practice. It means I have to get everything really clean, and probably the easiest way to clean this tube is just polish it in the lathe. I went a little lazier on the other pieces and just soaked them in some vinegar overnight. Well, I would say there's a fair amount of pretty mediocre TIG welds on here. And they're interspersed with some really terrible ones. I'm going to go ahead and grind this down and clean it up. Well, that's pretty cool, but obviously it needs to be a bit taller and make it adjustable. I think I'm going to go old school on this and do one that screws up and down. I'm going to do a threaded insert in this. The ID of the tube is 1.4 inches, so I think I'm going to turn this down to 1 1/8 inches. I need to pick out a thread, so got out the old machinery's handbook, kind of looked through. Acme thread would be good, but I want it to travel pretty quick, so I'm going to do 4 TPI, just so that I don't have to cut the thread as deep in it. I'm going to do the 29-degree stub thread, ground up an appropriate tool for it. There is a weld seam on the inside of the tube. So that this fits, I'll just mill a clearance slot in it. chose to weld this up with the screw in place, hoping that it would sort of act as a heat sink and keep the warping down a little bit. Turns out that didn't really work, and it tightened up a lot. After a little bit of deburring, I got that going pretty good. If I were to do this again, I would rough machine the insert, weld it into the tube, and then thread it before I welded the tube into the base. That's going to be really uncomfortable to sit on though, so let's make a seat for it. This is some reclaimed teak from an old picnic table. I've been kind of using this on a few different projects lately. I'm going to glue it up with some maple accents. This should give the stool a nice look and maybe double as a charcuterie board. The clear lacquer really brings out the figuring in the maple and really classes the whole thing up. For a shop stool, it might even be a little too ritzy. I really love the way this thing's coming together, but in order to get it fully buttoned up, I need a flange for here. Which means I guess I need to do some tuning on the plasma cutter, but that was sort of the whole point of this project anyway. Get a fresh nozzle on here. So what I did was I drew up a little drawing that's 1 inch by 1.5 inches, has a 1/2 inch hole in the center, and has one corner that's rounded off so I know which orientation it was cut in. And that let me go through and just adjust kerf width, cut speeds, pierce times, all that good stuff, and check the squareness of these as well. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good, and I think it's about as good as I can get without torch height control. So it turns out probably my problem was just a kind of trash nozzle. Let's go ahead and cut the last piece of this stool. Got the slag on that cleaned off, and I'd say that cut quality is pretty good, but it's still not quite good enough to nail that dimension. That's no matter. Alright, that feels like it'll smash on there. It might even be a little lower than it needs to be, but that's not really a bad thing. Oh, this is going to be a huge difference. It goes up a little higher than it needs to as well, but again, not a bad thing, and it feels plenty stable. I kind of like the raw steel look on this, especially with some of the oxide colors from welding. So I'm just going to hit with some Bow Shield T9. Of course, the nozzle's broken on this. Well, I think that's done, and it's certainly overdone. I gotta say, I really like the way this thing came out, and I feel like I learned a lot in the process. And I hope you enjoyed watching that.